15, somebody's texted in, no surprise you want to focus on world affairs tonight, steering the panel away from any comments on the Boris Johnson clown show. Well, we did actually plan this evening 2 or 3 weeks ago, because, you know, we do a bit of forward planning on this programme, and we decided that we would like to do something on world affairs. And judging by that first question, it was a good decision. Right, let's go to another call, 0345 6060973, if you'd like to ask our panel a question on anything to do with foreign policy and what's going on in the world. Shuvik is in Eltham. Hello, Shuvik.
Hello, Ian. Hello to the panel. I'd like to ask the panel, how do they believe the crisis in the Yemen can be resolved?
OK, well, that's a good question, because this subject seems to have fallen off the international news over the past few weeks or even few months. Borzou Daragahi from The Independent, how do you think that the situation in Yemen could be or should be resolved?
I mean, through diplomacy, first and foremost. And I think actually Yemen is actually a really, really great topic to bring up, because it is, in a way, the lowest hanging fruit of all of the Middle East conflicts that are creating so much tension in the region, in the Middle East and the broader Middle East. Afghanistan's really hard to figure out. Syria is a huge mess that is, involving several, super and regional powers. The Iraq dilemma is there's no easy solution there. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been going on for decades now. But Yemen is a country with very little oil, a desperate, poor population, and a war that really the local powers there stumbled into. Didn't expect it to go on this long. It's like almost 6 years now that this conflict has been going on. It pits Iran and Saudi Arabia against each other through proxies on the ground. And it is not benefiting really either country, definitely not benefiting Saudi Arabia. So it's, I think, one way that a diplomatic model where the Iranians, the Saudis, and their various allies could sit down at a table with international interlocutors that include the United States and the United Nations, as well as other powers, mediating and just, end this stupid, insane, and ultimately just tragic conflict.
But somebody's got to take an initiative, and let's say the Saudis or the Iranians are not going to do that. Who could do it? Who could bring about the talks?
That is the UN's role. I think there is a UN special envoy. I think Stephen could speak to this as well in terms of the EU's role and the US role as well in terms of trying to get the various parties to the negotiating table. But, there is a mechanism for resolving these kinds of conflicts. There are groups and organizations that serve as interlocutors, second track mediators, and so on, that get the discussions going. So it's not unprecedented. Other conflicts have been resolved before with the help of a UN-guided process.
Mitchell Reiss.
Well, I think the Biden administration has already appointed a senior diplomat to be the special envoy to try to bring the parties together. There have been some signs that Riyadh would like to limit its commitment. It's been very expensive and ultimately unsuccessful in realizing the goals it originally had. The big question mark in my mind is whether the Iranians want to reach an agreement. Do they want to continue to bleed Saudi Arabia through proxies, as was mentioned? Or do they want to end the conflict and move on? And we don't know the answer to that yet.
What is the incentive for anyone to do this, though, to actually end this conflict?
If I could just come in a second. I've been to Yemen. It is a beautiful, beautiful country. The architecture of Sana'a is quite extraordinary. And it is a very, very poor country. It's also running out of water. Its water table is sinking. The desalinization plants are not working because of the conflict. My hope is, the way these things end, like Borzou, they kind of burn themselves out when people get tired. And one of the best things that happened, and it's a sad way of putting it, was when Adnan Khashoggi was murdered. And it was blamed on the Saudis, who obviously did it. and it was blamed on MBS because, frankly, his arrogance led Saudi into this war, and with often American weapons. The Americans have stopped supplying weapons, and it's been a big blow to Saudi pride. And I think Mohammed bin Salman is perhaps looking for a way out. The problem, as Mitchell says, is the Iranians are backing the Houthis, who are this kind of vaguely Shia, I mean, lots of different kinds of Shia, but vaguely Shia tribe who were in revolt against quite an odious kind of dictator who's now gone and who took the country in a shock revolt and have never given it up. So I think people will burn themselves out, but there's no question that the Houthis, I think, are there to stay. And Yemen needs our help. Believe me, it does. It's a very poor country. People are chewing khat all the time. Khat takes a lot of water. It's one of the few capitals in the world that is expected to run out of drinkable water in the next 10 years, and that will be shocking also.
Stefanie.
I mean, as one could maybe hope with the new administration in the US and at the same time a new president in Iran, there's a bit of a window to maybe move forward. And they're talking again in Vienna. There's hope to somehow revive against the nuclear deal. I don't know if there's any opportunity in these talks to also widen them. But I mean, first of all, the catastrophic situation there, and it has really dropped off the coverage. I mean, even at the time, it was always far more focused on Syria and the situation in Syria than there was in Yemen. I mean, I find living in Britain, at least the BBC does quite a good job from time to time covering Yemen. But in Germany, I hardly ever hear anything about it. And I think there's also really a moral argument for the United Nations to play a stronger role and make sure that the least that they have to provide is the most basic help to people dying, starving to death, thousands of children dying of all kinds of diseases that are now have been breaking out for years. So I think it's a very sad testimony of the West doing pretty much nothing and leaving people in Yemen.
It's interesting what you say about media coverage of this conflict, because you're right, it doesn't feature much in this country, let alone others. But I remember, I think sometime maybe the year before last, I did a phone-in on it, and the lines were really, really busy. And there is so much interest in foreign affairs, which sometimes you think the editors of newspapers and television and possibly radio programmes too sometimes don't quite understand the appetite for foreign affairs. And that must frustrate all four of you, I guess, to one degree or another. Stephen, you're laughing.
Well, I do laugh, having lived in Britain off and on for 9 years, though in separate tranches. I've always was shocked at local BBC television news. I mean, it was all about the traffic accident at the Oxford roundabout. and there's this whole world out there which is full of very good BBC correspondents who almost never get on this 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock BBC news. And, you know, this is a long argument. I fought with Tony Hall about it. The World Service is pretty good, but the people of Britain don't really get the benefit of this fee they're paying for all these very good correspondents who are all over the world, whose stuff never gets, or rarely gets, put it that way, rarely gets domestic airtime.
But if I may defend Britain for once, I mean, in comparison to Germany and other European countries, the Brits have a far wider horizon. Of all countries in Europe, I think Britain has the widest horizon when it comes to foreign policy.
Global Britain, Stefanie.
Yeah, global Britain. And in that case, I agree. It's really much more global Britain than Europe. If you enjoy that, have it.
And Borzou, from a newspaper point of view, I mean, actually, world affairs in the mainstream quality newspapers and indeed your own website gets quite a good shout, doesn't it?
I think it does. I think there is a there's a real need for us as writers, producers, and so on to package or write or style the stories in a way that makes them more attractive to readers. So not straight news, but finding human angles, if you will, that bring the story home. Find ways and explain the ways in which, for example, something happening in Yemen could impact someone living in Chicago or London. I think that's a challenge for us, and it's really our duty as foreign correspondents to try to do that.
Mitchell, you've been in Britain and Europe for the last couple of months or so. What do you notice about the difference in coverage of world affairs here compared to what you're used to in the States?
I think generally the British public is much more literate, having a wonderful literary tradition than the United States. The United States right now, I think for a variety of economic reasons, a lot of the journalism is looking for a sensationalism or celebrities. And aside from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and a few other papers, I think a lot of journalists and journalism is really struggling across the states, even while some independent journalists are really putting forth remarkably good stories. So it's, right now we're also having an issue in the United States about re-understanding or reinterpreting our own history. So I'm not sure that it's the best time to compare the United States in terms of international coverage. But I do find that at least the highbrow newspapers and coverage in the UK is very, very good.
Let's go back to Shuvik, who asked the question about the Yemen. Shuvik, you got any ideas?
Yes, I mean, a lot of it resolves. I mean, it's a very good discussion from the panel. A lot of it does resolve. Yemen does feed into other conflicts. I mean, if the situation in Yemen was resolved, the situation in Afghanistan or Israel, Palestine would be easier to resolve. It relates to the JCPOA, which was created by Catherine Ashton and Federica Mogherini. And also, Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee is heavily involved in supplying to the Yemen. So, I mean, as a power, as Britain and France were the two main powers in the region from the First World War onwards, and that was taken over from the Suez Crisis by the United States. Syria is, of course, backed by Russia. So, right from the 19th century, the Middle East was an extremely sensitive area because of oil. So, and it's still it's a sensitive area because of oil. Because of oil-related industries and because of the weapons going into the area and now nuclear weapons as well. So, I mean, it's still, I mean, a lot of these conflicts can really only be resolved through diplomacy, through multilateral diplomacy at the United Nations.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, somebody might have a question about the United Nations a little bit later, but the United Nations constantly seems to fail to step up to the plate in conflicts like this. Shuvik, thank you very much indeed. We'll come to more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel. Stefanie Bolzen from Welt, Borzou Daragahi, who's international correspondent for The Independent, Mitchell Reiss, former US ambassador to Northern Ireland and advisor to George W. Bush, and Stephen Erlanger, chief European diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times. But before we come to your calls, let's get the latest news headlines. It's coming up to 8:30 on LBC. Here's Tim Humphrey.
Serena.
It's Serena Farrow.
Boris Johnson's defended his policy on self-isolation after he has warned thousands of people could delete the NHS COVID app to avoid it. Labour's warning, though, of a summer of chaos with changes to quarantine rules not expected to take effect in England until the 16th of August. Lorry drivers are now going to be allowed to work for longer hours because of a shortage of workers. The government's announced the temporary extension, which starts on Monday, to allow them to make longer journeys. And Joe Biden's joined the Prime Minister in condemning the assassination of Haiti's president in his own home. His wife was also shot in the attack and is now in a critical condition in hospital. LBC weather, though, showers will die out by midnight, leaving clear spells and the odd misty patch, though, come morning, a low of 9 degrees.
This is LBC.
Everyone
3 on LBC. You're listening to Cross Question, or you may be watching Cross Question, with Stefanie Bolzen, Borzou, Daragahi, Mitchell Reiss and Stephen Erlanger. Let's go to your next question. It's from Andy in Tunbridge in Kent. Hello, Andy.
Hello, Ian. How are you?
Hi, very well, thank you. What would you like to ask?
The US and Allied invasion of Afghanistan and now the withdrawal of troops from there, did it make Afghanistan a safer place? Has it made the rest of the world a safer place? And particularly poignant on a day like today when we remember the 52 dead 16 years ago on those attacks in London.
And of course, this is the week that troops are pulling out of Afghanistan. Stefanie Bolzen, let's come to you first. Was it worth it, I suppose, is the summing up of that question?
Well, I very much think it depends on who you ask. I mean, I guess I was thinking of the families of, I don't have the numbers now, of hundreds of British soldiers who died in Afghanistan. And Mitchell will know much better than me, but how many American soldiers died, and also German soldiers, and of course not even talking about the civilians. So was it worth it? I still think it was worth, at least for some years, that there was stability in terms of Afghanistan not being a place where terrorists could prepare their next attacks on whatever soil, and also in terms of education for girls. I mean, I was 3 or 4 times in Afghanistan during the war. Actually, I was also embedded with the US Marines for some time, and you could feel that something was changing. There was, of course, some progress. There was progress in especially education for women. Women were voted into parliament. There was a lot of infrastructure being built, but it's so tragic to now see, especially then American troops leaving in the night, really disappearing, and thinking of the the Afghan National Army and the people there now left behind. I mean, sooner or later this was going to happen, but it's a very depressing situation, I think, but I do think it was worth it, yes.
Even though, I mean, Andy asks if it's made the world a safer place. Is it really possible to argue that it has?
We don't know, do we? I mean, it's such a long time ago, but we remember the time after 9/11, and I remember talking to a lot of my American friends who insisted that this had to happen. You had to go into Afghanistan, you had to go into Iraq to make the world a safer place, because you didn't know what potential there was of threat to us and to other parts of the world. So it's a bit hypothetical, but I still think, yes, it did make the world a safer place, at least for a time.
Mitchell Reiss.
Yeah, I think I want to agree with what Stefanie was saying in terms of the opportunities that were available in Afghanistan for the last 2 decades because of the U.S. presence and the multinational presence there. The fact that Afghanistan wasn't used as a staging ground for another 9/11 type attack on the American homeland, that certainly was an accomplishment. But something she said I think is important. There are very few victories in diplomacy or elsewhere that are permanent. What the United States has done over the last 2 decades is create an opportunity for Afghanistan to become a more normal state. And the jury's still out whether that's possible. I don't like the trends, frankly, and I don't agree with withdrawing the American military presence. I don't think that it's necessary. I don't think it sends the right signal to our friends and allies around the world, especially Taiwan. But again, I understand why the Biden administration is justifying it. Did it make the world a better place? Yes, it did, for a relatively short period of time. But the alternative would have been worse.
Stephen Erlanger.
I grew up at the end of the Vietnam generation. This feels very much like Vietnam to me. We went through a period of Vietnamization, which was a cover for us to leave. Things lasted for a while. Babra Karmal, whom the Soviets left behind, lasted 2.5 years before Taliban took over. I think this is not going to be a quick process. I think the big cities will be held by this government, but the civil war will continue. I think it was inevitable whether Al Gore had been president or Bush, that we would have gone in after Osama bin Laden, after 9/11. That was a given, and gone after Al-Qaeda. We had to do it. What changed everything, seems to me, was Iraq, which was a terrible mistake, which took attention away from Afghanistan, which took troops away from Afghanistan. And I think we would have had a better experience had we kept a serious military presence longer in the beginning in Afghanistan. But we're not good at nation building. I mean, we're just not. And it seems to me at some point after Osama bin Laden died and Al-Qaeda was dispersed, that the late Richard Holbrooke was right, that we needed a regional settlement. He called it AFPAKIA, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, all the neighbors, and that there had to be a negotiated settlement worked out then. Obama thought he was a fool. Nothing happened. I just fear we're back into a tragedy foretold, but I don't think it's going to be as quick as some people think, and I think particularly the women of Afghanistan will fight back. I don't think it's going to be an easy return to the kind of Taliban structure. I'm curious what Borzou thinks, but that's my take.
Well, we're about to find out. Borzou.
Well, I think that I just spoke to a representative of the Afghan parliament yesterday, and they were quite worried about, as Stefanie pointed out, the optics of the way that the U.S. left and the other NATO troops. It gave the Taliban a sort of propaganda victory. Look, they're fleeing from Afghanistan in the dead of the night. And, really right now, it's a really critical moment in Afghanistan. The Afghan security forces need to step up and defend what they have built over the last 20 years. Afghan civil society needs to stop lining up at the passport offices to try to get out of the country and take responsibility for the country that they know and love, and stay put. They're leaving in droves. I usually live in Istanbul, and you can see the Afghan middle class coming into town in large numbers, escaping the country for fear of the Taliban taking over. Well, they're making it a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that the international community still has a huge role to play in lifting the morale of the Afghan security forces, in encouraging the Afghan middle class, what there is of it, to remain focused and stay put, and defend the gains that Stefanie was talking about and that others have talked about. I was in Afghanistan right after the Taliban was toppled, and it was just a disaster. Kabul was nothing but rubble. And I have the sort of advantage of having been able to go almost like every 5 years or so back afterward. And you could see not just Kabul, but other cities developing, building the rubble being cleared, new schools being built, new businesses, entrepreneurs, and so on. They have a lot to defend. And Najibullah hung on for 2.5 years after the Soviets withdrew, and then the militias started fighting each other, paving the way for the Taliban to come in. You don't have that situation anymore. You have a legitimate government that's not a puppet of the Soviet Union or anyone else, that's legitimately elected. You have a security infrastructure that has been tutored for 20 years by the United States and NATO. They have a lot of advantages. And you have a Taliban that's at least talkable to, even though they're, kind of fractured themselves and, not coherent in what they want and where they want to take Afghanistan.
That's really interesting when you say that they're talkable to, because we've always thought that there was, there might have been back channels from time to time, but are you saying that the situation now is very different in that regard?
Of course. I mean, we're talking, the United States is talking to the Taliban, the Russians have, the only country in the region that doesn't have any relations with the Taliban at this point is India. And they're quite worried about that. And they're quite worried about Pakistan resuming its role in sponsoring the Taliban as a way of kind of confronting India. That's a real concern there. But everyone is talking to the Taliban. They have an office in Doha and so on. And I'm sure Stephen is following that as well. But they have diplomatic channels. The question is, do those diplomatic channels, how much control they have over the fighters, the various armed forces that are on the ground?
Let's go back to Andy. What's your view? Do you think that the war in Afghanistan has made the world a safer place?
Well, when you look at these terrorist attacks across the globe since the invasion, it's very hard to argue that that's the case. But I think if one looks at what's it done for Afghanistan, there do seem to be some positives, particularly in relation to education and women. And I think, we can't really criticise people for leaving. If you're frightened, if you're terrified and you can get out, you probably will. And even though you could argue, should we ever have gone in, no one has successfully invaded Afghanistan, from the Greeks to the British to the Soviets and now to the Allies. But having gone in, we did seem to make some improvements. And when you listen to Tom Tugendhat and Rory Stewart talking about it from their personal knowledge, you think, could we have stayed? Could we have helped? Could we have trained the civil authorities, the police, the army, and made it and continue those benefits that all that the losses of those?
But we have been. I mean, you're almost talking as if we haven't been doing that. We have been doing that.
Yeah, we have, and now we've stopped doing it. And why? Why are we stopping now? I take that point as a feeling about Vietnam now with Joe Biden coming in, but this is what we were doing. We were training their forces, but we're leaving now. And the Taliban may well retake. They might not only destabilise Afghanistan, they could well destabilise Pakistan and other surrounding states. And you just look at all of the investment that's gone in, all the pain that's gone into helping out in Afghanistan, and you think, why are we leaving now? It is not safe. If people are leaving in their droves, it isn't a safe place to be. And you cannot criticise people for trying to leave. If you were there with your family right now, you'd be out, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Andy, great question, and thanks for your comments. 0345 6060 973. More of your questions in just a second. It's 8:45.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast with Tom Swarbrick. Weekday mornings from 7.
Millions of people, those being asked to self-isolate now, are fit and well and healthy. We've got the tests in place that can see whether they've got coronavirus or not. Why are we waiting? Kwasi Kwarteng is the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Conservative MP for Spelthorne.
Clearly, if you've been double jabbed, you represent less of a risk than someone who hasn't had any jab. Some people are saying that we're lifting restrictions too quickly. Other people are saying that we've had them for too long. The balance that we've struck in terms of August the 16th for self-isolation rules makes sense.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast with Tom Swarbrick. Weekday mornings from 7. Listen live on Global Player, LBC.
49. If you've just tuned in, Stefanie Bolzen is with us from Welt, Borzou Daragahi from The Independent, Mitchell Reiss, former US Ambassador to Northern Ireland and advisor to George W. Bush, and Stephen Erlanger from the New York Times. Now, I'm going to ask you all to be relatively brief in your answer to the next question because I want to fit another one in before we finish at 9. Ravi is in Ruislip. Hello, Ravi.
Oh, hi, Ian. Hi, everyone. Just a quick question. When will the UN will actually act like the UN?
Expand?
Like, we say United Nations and we are peacekeepers, diplomacy, stop wars, stop conflicts, make a better world. But we're not seeing any of that. So what's gone wrong?
Mitchell Reiss, what's gone wrong with the UN? Why can't it act like the UN is supposed to act?
Well, I think it probably doesn't do a very good job publicizing its successes. It has peacekeeping operations in more than 36 countries around the world. It is doing a lot of good. You only hear the negative stories. But I think the larger question is we get the United Nations we deserve. If the permanent 5 members of the Security Council can't agree, it's very hard for the UN to be successful in tackling some of the world's biggest challenges. So this has always been a problem with the UN. It's not anything terribly new. And so, again, I think our expectations sometimes are outsized for what we think the UN could do, what we want it to do, what we hope it'll do. But it has had some successes. It is more effective than not having the UN at all.
Borzou.
Yeah, I think Michael's right. And you look at a situation like Libya, where ostensibly all of the players are signing on to the Libyan peace process. Meanwhile, all the players are funneling in weapons against the UN's rules and deploying mercenaries to the country to meet their strategic aims. All the meanwhile saying, "Oh yes, we support the UN process, we support the UN peace process," and just blatantly violating international law and international norms. What's going to happen? You can't. If none of the countries and none of the actors are acting in good faith, what can the UN do? And that's happened. That example of Libya has been replicated in numerous countries.
Stefanie.
Quite a minimalistic response to that. Again, it's better to have the United Nations than not having it. And of course, as long as you have the veto powers, China, Russia, the US, you will always have very differing perspective and interests in certain conflicts. I mean, you see it time and again with new conflicts in Israel and the Palestinians. So I think, but if you try to change that setup, then the UN would very quickly collapse. So I agree, there are some really good stories and success stories coming out of the United Nations, and it's better to have it than to see it collapse because it doesn't work.
Well, you're all being far briefer than I was expecting you to be, Stephen, which gives you a little bit more time.
Well, look, it's a lovely idea. It's as good as the Security Council wants it to be. It's like most multilateral organizations. Look at the World Health Organization. It could be so much better than it is, even on the virus, but big countries like China have interests to protect. I would like to see the UN modernize. I mean, it is still a post-World War II organization, and I think the Security Council somehow should be expanded to include India, to include Germany. It's not clear to me why France and Britain should be the only European powers on the Security Council, and just because they have nukes and, were perceived to have won the Second World War. So I would like to see it broadened. I think
that's a stretch in France's stretch.
Yeah, I don't know.
France won the Second World War, but there we go.
Well, no, but this was part of the gift. And, some people said, well, the EU should have one seat. But of course, Britain and France would never agree with that. Certainly Britain, not now. But it does do, when you look at UNHCR, when you look at UNESCO, when you look at what it does for refugees, for health, it does a lot of very good things. And the United States, for instance, still paying 22% of all the budget. And people don't quite understand sometimes that a lot of the good that's being done comes from the generosity of big countries. One would want it to do better, but I mean, frankly, it's like most things, unless you have sticks, if you only have carrots, it's not usually good enough.
Ravi, I would come back to you, but I do want to fit in this other question, but thank you very much for your call. We started off with a question about China, and we're going to finish with one. David is in Ilford. David, what would you like to ask the panel?
Hi, Ian. Hi, panellists. My question is, if China should decide to attack and try to invade Taiwan, what do they think NATO's response should be?
Borzou.
I mean, that's a little bit out of my lane. I'm not an expert in the Far East Asia. It's not an area of my specialty. But I think that I can answer in terms of what NATO would do, which is I don't believe much in that particular scenario. It's not really in NATO's preserve. It is kind of in the U.S. Sphere of influence. And I think that if that were to happen, there would be a lot of sanctions. There would be it would be a cataclysmic event. There would be a lot of sanctions. There would be a lot of condemnation and so on. I'm not sure China is that risk hungry because it would create a big, huge mess. But I don't think that the response would be military from the part of NATO.
Stephen.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, NATO is a Euro-Atlantic organization. It is talking about China a lot, but more China coming into Europe. It is an American problem. The point is to deter China, and we need to do more to do that, to make sure China understands the costs of any invasion of Taiwan. They are building a military that could attack Taiwan. One can ask when, next 5 years, next 10 years. They are building missiles designed to attack U.S. aircraft carriers. They're increasing their nuclear arsenal. Their military budget is the second largest in the world now, next to the United States. They're building a big navy. And their interest is the Pacific. They want to drive us out of the Pacific. So it is a problem for the United States, for its allies, for Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And the United States has always had a policy of strategic ambiguity about whether it would defend Taiwan militarily. But it's not clear anymore China's worried about the ambiguity. So I think a much more active effort at deterring China through defense spending and development is very important, it would seem to me.
Okay, Mitchell.
I want to amend the question and not say what would NATO do, but rather what would Europe do. And I think it's extremely important that Europe let the Chinese know that the economic and financial consequences would be severe should they attack Taiwan. The fear I have is that they can look back at the Western response after Tiananmen, where sanctions were imposed, and within a year or two or three, they all melted away. And it was a cost that obviously the Communist Party decided was worthwhile. And they may think again that this is a cost that they can bear. It'll be worthwhile. It'll be tough for a year or two, but eventually everybody's going to want to trade again with the Chinese. So I think the clearest, hardest message that the Europeans can deliver in advance would be the best help for deterring the type of attack in the first place.
Stefanie, we haven't got much time left. I don't know whether that's a relief or a frustration.
There's not much I can add to this, but I think having in mind that only recently NATO in a declaration called China a systemic challenge, that is then also a challenge to NATO and especially, as Mitchell just said, to the Europeans, to if that happened, if there was any attempt by China to invade Taiwan, then you can not only have words, then you really have to show what you mean by that. And of course, the focus of defense unavoidably will also for NATO move much more to the Indo-Pacific in the future.
Quick final text question from Sarah in Crouch End. Who does the panel think is the most impressive world leader of today? Who shall I go to first? Mitchell.
Well, I don't think you're going to like this answer, but the most impressive world leader is Xi Jinping. Given what he has done and consolidating his power, extending his term in office, being able to lead the Chinese through some very difficult challenges that they face, and essentially being a peer competitor now of the United States and recognized as such. It's been a very impressive performance. It's not one that I want to endorse or support in any way, but in terms of a leader on his or her own terms, I think I'd put him at the top of the class.
Stephen?
I have to agree with that. I mean, in terms of having an impact on the world, I think there are a lot of vulnerabilities. I think Xi Jinping is less strong than he appears, even inside the party, but he has set China on a course toward greatness built on others that is very impressive for a country that big and that not very long ago could barely feed itself.
I'm not going to allow Xi Jinping as the answer for you, Borzou or Stefanie. Borzou, you first.
I mean, I'm a big fan of Angela Merkel, and I think in terms of values. But I gotta say that it's just watching Vladimir Putin operate and watching the impact that he's had on the West from the just sort of the audacity of the Kremlin's mendacity, so to speak, is overwhelming and breathtaking, and the unleashing of these gray zone operations, offensive operations in various parts of the world, taking a country that has very little in terms of resources and making it a player in the Middle East right now. For example, if you compare Russia's role in the Middle East to these days to 15 years ago, it's incredible how much influence this country has thanks to Vladimir Putin.
Stefanie, let me explain the question a bit more. This is not the world's best dictator. It's the most impressive world leader.
I must say, I'm a bit shocked with what the panel is saying. and I certainly won't say Angela Merkel now, just because I'm German. But maybe let's put it this way. It's going to be interesting to see, once she's leaving the stage, especially the European stage, Angela Merkel, whether we will miss her. Keeping Europe together, let's put it this way, and in that, answering the question whether she was maybe a European leader.
And your choice for most impressive world leader?
I can't find any. I'm sorry.
How about Jacinda Ardern?
Foster? No.
Arlene Foster.
No. I think Jacinda Ardern deserves a bit of a shout out here. I think she's rather impressive. Listen, thank you so much. I wasn't sure whether a specialist cross question like this would work, but it has, and it's thanks to you four. Thank you so much for joining us. Mitchell Reiss, Borzou Daragahi, Stephen Erlanger and Stefanie Bolzen. You can catch up on Cross Question on the podcast or on Global Player or on the LBC YouTube channel. More next week, Monday at 8. We're going to talk about panic attacks in a moment. Have you ever had one? I want to know all about it and the aftermath. It's 9:02.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Prime Minister's been told it's entirely predictable people will delete the NHS COVID app to avoid having to self-isolate. Although most COVID restrictions in England are being lifted on July the 19th,